Welcome to Project Command. I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and on today's episode, we're talking all about how to deploy new equipment in your department. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, it really helps us if you like, subscribe, or share this episode with a friend or a coworker who you think would appreciate it. Every share helps more fire service professionals learn the skills and mindset to deliver stronger, smarter projects. All right, now let's get to the episode. Welcome back, everyone. On today's episode, I want to talk to you all about how to roll out or deploy new equipment and technology in your fire department. Now, this is something that we do quite a bit of in the fire service. There's always something that's got to get rolled out, whether you got, maybe some grant money and you bought some equipment with it, or where maybe your lease expired on some equipment that you use, maybe your extrication equipment, or maybe it was just time for an upgrade. But this is something that we do quite a bit of. And for the department that I work for, I've been involved with a lot of these equipment and technology rollouts. And I want to share some of the things I've learned through the course of those different projects with you. Because the thing about a technology rollout or an equipment rollout is when you do it right, these can be great PR wins. The guys in the field, guys and girls in the field feel good about it. They're excited to get new equipment. It can make operations better. Maybe you put some new radios out there that are, easier to use, or you get a 12 lead monitor out there, something like that. These can be good PR, good morale wins, and they can make things better and smoother for the people, the end users, the people that are going to use them. But when we do these wrong, these can cause a lot of frustration, a lot of questions. You get a lot of emails. Maybe you get some things that get broken because people didn't use them correctly, didn't charge them, didn't take care of them correctly. So can give you some headaches downstream, but also there's a safety element with this, especially when we're talking about life safety equipment. Maybe that's radios, thermal imaging cameras, masks, you name it. Anything. I mean, there's a lot of life safety equipment obviously involved in firefighting. And when we push new equipment out and we don't do a good job of training and communicating on that, there definitely can be some safety and operational risks. And there's also the concept of technical debt, which is something I want to talk to you about. Technical debt is a fancy way of saying the stuff that didn't get done on a project. And technical debt kind of builds on itself, just like any other kind of debt. So let's say you have a project to roll out new thermal imaging cameras, and maybe you don't update your SOG and you don't log in all the thermal imaging cameras that you reclaimed after you put out your new ones. That would be called technical debt. And what tends to happen in a lot of departments is you get a bunch of projects that don't get fully finished. Maybe they get 90% of the way there, but they don't get 100% of the way there. And what you end up with is a pile of technical debt from a bunch of different projects. So the next thing you know, your administrative people have, 6 or 8 SOGs from 3 or 4 different projects that are, need to be updated. Logistics is calling you because they can't find 2 or 3 of the thermal imaging cameras that were supposed to be picked up. And you're getting a lot of questions because you didn't push out a training video. And so this is an example of how technical debt over the course of projects can build up, and it just tends to slow down other work that you need to get done. So that's just another thing that can happen when we don't do these technology or equipment rollouts the right way. So safety and operational risks we're going to see. We might see technical debt build up. We might see frustration from our end users, which is our firefighters. So just a bunch of reasons why we really want to take the time and do this right. So how do we do it right? Well, let's get into the first step of a technology rollout. And the good news is the first step of a technology rollout is also one of the first steps on pretty much any project you're ever going to do. And that is to determine what the requirements are. Now, recall from previous episodes, when you build your scope, like the work that you need to get done specifically, you really need to collect requirements from stakeholders, from your project team, from your project sponsor, anyone that you think might have information about the project, you collect those requirements, and the requirements are the specific elements of the work that have to get accomplished in order for us to consider the project a success. Now, I want to talk about thermal imaging cameras a bunch on this episode because that's actually a project that I'm working on right now. I'm working with the Battalion Chief of Support Services and our logistics folks to push out a bunch of new thermal imaging cameras we've got for our whole fire department. And we have a large department, 23 fire stations, 650 sworn members. So, there's a lot that goes into that. And so requirements are things like where specifically do these thermal imaging cameras need to go? Which stations, which ones are going to which units? Because you got to keep track of these. So different serial numbers are going to different places. You got a spreadsheet you got to put together to keep track of what's going where. The requirements are things like, do we need to provide more specific training on this particular thermal imaging camera, or have we done enough? What's the timeline? Is there a specific deadline that these thermal imaging cameras have to get rolled out on? Is there a date we need to get them out by? Or is it just whenever we get a chance? And then are there any SOGs or policies that are going to need to get updated as a part of this technology rollout? So those are examples of requirements that we have to figure out for the rollout. So think about that, like what are the specific things that have to get done? If you jump into that time machine and you go to the end of the project and you look back on it, you would say, okay, yeah, we got all the things done. We put out an SOG on this. We put out training on this. We have a spreadsheet so we know exactly which units were taken to which thermal imaging camera units were taken to which apparatus. So we know exactly where things are. We have all of the accessories that go with them. That's the charging mount, the cord, the user manual has been given to everybody, et cetera, et cetera. So step number one, you need to collect your requirements. And that's, like I said, that's going to be pretty much standard for any project that you do. You need to know the specific elements of the work that have to be met in order to consider it a success. So we get all our requirements, and if you want to, take it to the next level, you can put all those together into a scope, or maybe you don't think that's necessary. But now we have our requirements, so we know the technical details of how this rollout needs to go. Which brings me to what I call the 4 pillars of equipment rollouts. And those are communication, training, documentation, and safety. All right, so let's go through these one at a time. The first is communication. Now, communicating about a rollout is really important for a few different reasons. First of all, whenever you're asking your workforce to do something different, there's going to be an element of cultural change there. And so communicating early and often during these processes can be really beneficial to establish buy-in. And when you communicate, one of the things you really want to focus on is the why. So remember that in operations and the fire service, there's a lot going on. You've got the calls, you've got community events, you've got people coming by the fire station, you've got training that you have to do, training that you want to do. There's always somebody going through something. Proby's got, he's got to get through driver pump operator school, or you got somebody preparing for the lieutenant's test. There's a lot going on, is what I'm saying. And so if you're asking people to throw another thing on the pile, you really need to explain why. Why are we using new thermal imaging cameras? Why are we switching to a new kind of 12-lead monitor? Why are we switching radios? Why is there a new policy or a new system for this thing? So firefighters really like to know the why. So explain it. Maybe, hey, the lease expired on our old equipment, and so we had to move to a new one. Or, hey, that 12-lead monitor didn't meet FDA approval, so we have to go to this one. So just help firefighters understand why this change is happening. And the other thing that you want to accomplish with that communication is establishing familiarity with the equipment. So first you let people know that it's happening, then you let people know the timeline. Then of course there's going to be communication surrounding the training, which we'll get to in the next section, but you're establishing familiarity with the equipment that's coming. And when you do this, I like to try to communicate this over multiple different touch points. Now, touch points are just mediums that the communication goes out across. So email is a touch point, Your department newsletter is a touch point. Station visits where you talk about it is a touch point. Talking about it at your officer in-service meeting is a touch point. And the reason I think it's important to send it out across multiple touch points is you never know what people are focusing on. Like maybe people are, not going to read the department newsletter, but they will read their email or whatever. And so putting it out across multiple mediums just increases the likelihood that your target audience is going to see the message and internalize it. So with this communication and really any communication, be mindful of which mediums you're putting it out across. And just be deliberate about that so that, because think back on communication 101. You have the sender, which is the person giving the information, the receiver, which is the person receiving the information, and the message. So it's not just about you talking to the end user. You have to focus on the message. And part of that is figuring out how people are going to hear that message. Okay, so communicate early, communicate often, let people know when it's happening and why it's happening. Okay, let's jump to training. Now, whenever you're pushing something out, you need to determine, do we need to train on this? And sometimes you will, and sometimes you won't. And, for things that you might not need to train on, if are buying a piece of equipment and maybe it's exactly the same as the old one, it's just a slightly different model. Maybe you just want to put out, something on Target Solutions, a little one-sheeter, and you'll call that good. Or maybe you're rolling out a new 12 lead monitor and it's, you had Zoll and now you're moving to the LifePak and it's a totally different, brand of equipment and you need people to use it right, obviously, because lives depend on it. So that's an example of something you'd want to do a lot of training about. So figuring out, do we need to train and how much we need to train is really, really important with this type of project. And you don't have to make this decision on your own. In fact, you shouldn't make this decision on your own. This is where we need to consider our stakeholders. Now, a critical stakeholder on any equipment or technology rollout is going to be your training section or your training coordinator or your training officer. And the reason it's important to loop them in is because, first of all, they may have already trained on this recently. Maybe you're rolling out a new thermal imaging camera and maybe the last department-wide training they did was on that. And maybe they'll say, hey, listen, I think we actually covered this, pretty thoroughly in this training. So maybe we just do, a video and that should be sufficient based off of the training we've already done on it. So consult with your training folks to figure out how much training they think is necessary. And then you're going to want to run that by your project sponsor, the person who authorized the work. Say, something to the effect of, hey, this is the conversation I had with training. They feel like this is appropriate. Do you agree? So just make sure that you establish or that you get that buy-in rather from your project sponsor to make sure that they're comfortable with the level of training associated with the equipment that's coming out. And it may be necessary to talk to whoever, is in charge of your operations section. Maybe that's your ops chief or an assistant chief. Just run it by them and make sure they feel comfortable with it, particularly when it's safety equipment. Now, the other thing to think about with training is there's a lot of different ways that you can train people. And of course, we all kind of understand this. There's the video, there's an email with maybe an attached PDF, there's in-person training. Maybe you have your battalion chiefs go station to station and do like a little, question and answer session about it. There's a bunch of different ways that you can train and make people aware of technology or equipment that's coming out. So pick the one that you think is most appropriate for your project. And that'll be decided by how much training do they need and also how much time do you have to get this done. So sometimes you have a very tight timeline to get equipment rolled out in. And if that's the case, you might need to think about ways that you can get it done more quickly. So maybe, you have a central hub of training where people, engines come out of service or trucks come out of service and you provide that training. Or maybe you even just record a video and you send that out. So consider how much training they need and what your timeline is. Now, the last thing I want to say about the training side of this is from a project management perspective, this is going to be a really critical dependency, meaning that it has to be done before other things can be done. And it's probably going to take the most time. So you really want to take the time to figure out what's going to be specifically required from a training perspective and how long it's going to take. And of course, how long it's going to take is directly linked to the way that you provide that training. Is it in person or is it virtual? So you really want to get this figured out, not just because training is probably the single most important part of a technology rollout, but because it's also the thing that's going to take the longest. And you really need to figure it out before you can figure out the rest of the timeline. And one more quick thing I want to say about this is you want to try to figure out what is an acceptable threshold for getting this training done. So if you have a huge department and you say, hey, we're not going to move forward with our rollout until 100% of our people have had in-person training, that may not be practical. So, especially when you think about, people are on vacation, you've got people on light duty, people on extended injury leave. So, work with your stakeholders, that's your safety section, your training section, and maybe the ops chief to figure out what's an acceptable threshold of training that we need to meet before we can roll this out. And maybe it is 100%. Maybe if it's a safety thing, maybe it is 100%. But have that discussion with your stakeholders and figure out what an acceptable threshold of training is before you can roll this out. Okay, now let's talk about safety. So, safety and training are very closely related. Mainly because if you don't do a good job of training people on new life safety equipment, then there's a safety risk. But beyond that, when it comes to the safety of a technology or equipment rollout, this is all about risk forecasting. Now, risk forecasting, again, just a fancy way of saying you sit down with your project team and your stakeholders and you think about all the things that can go wrong. And really important, this is a really important thing for any project, but especially with equipment rollouts. And things that can go wrong aren't always safety. You can have somebody doesn't use the equipment right, it gets damaged, et cetera, et cetera. But having some time set aside at the beginning of a project to sit down with the people who you think are going to be relevant for this discussion and mapping out the things that can go wrong can be really beneficial to ensuring that those things don't go wrong. So we don't need to belabor the point and go on and on about this, but the point I want to make here about safety is whenever you're rolling out new equipment, at the very least, you're going to want to consult with your safety section or safety officer or whoever is in charge of safety, broadly speaking, for your department. And the likelihood is that they're either going to be a stakeholder or a project team member for any kind of an equipment or technology rollout. Okay, so we've covered safety, we've covered training, and we've covered communication. The last one in my 4 pillars of equipment rollouts is documentation, the most frequently missed element of a technology rollout or an equipment rollout. Now, the documentation side of this is important because for a couple of reasons. First of all, you want to avoid technical debt. So you go through your whole project, you get your equipment rolled out, but you don't update your SOGs, and now you have SOGs which are referencing old technology or a way of doing business which is no longer accurate. That's not good for safety reasons, it's not good for liability reasons, and it's just technical debt that you want to avoid. And beyond that, this is just part of running a professional project is if you change something, you have to make sure that your department's documents change with it. But beyond all of that, if you don't adequately define how, when, and where you want this equipment used, you're going to end up with low compliance, meaning people are just not going to use it the way that you want them to. This is going to lead to equipment getting broken, lost, or potentially even some safety concerns down the road. So you really need to take the time to get the documentation updated for technology rollouts, and really for any project, but particularly for these. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing that you're going to want to do, and I like to do this early on in a project, is assign somebody to do a review of your department's policies, SOGs, whatever, department documents, and just flag all of the SOGs or policies that mention the equipment that's being impacted. So if you're rolling out new Bluetooth technology, you're going to want somebody to review and flag all the policies that talk about radio communication or anything related to that. So just go through and identify. Now that actually is a huge step because it gives you a sense of how much work needs to be done from the document perspective. Maybe they go through and they say, hey, there's not a single policy that we have that addresses thermal imaging camera use. Okay, well, now at least you know you don't need to update anything, but you are going to need to draft a new SOG or policy. Or maybe they come back and they say, hey, there's 10 SOGs that govern this, this in some form or fashion. Okay, well, that's a lot of work updating and reviewing. So just good to know at the beginning. And the last thing I want to say about this is that when it comes to drafting new SOGs or just even updating new policies or SOGs, I like to do it collaboratively. And so how I'll do that is I'll assign a small group of people on my project team as call it whatever you want, documentation or SOG review or whatever. And then you take that document and you share it. So you put it in a Microsoft Word document and you share it with everybody. And that just allows you to work on it collaboratively, which I've found speeds things up and it makes sure that you don't miss anything. So you just end up with a better product overall. Okay, so quick recap here. We started our equipment rollout by collecting our requirements. So what's the timeline? Where does it need to go? Do we need to get training done, et cetera, et cetera. And then we started with our communication. So we communicated early and often. We made sure that we explained the why behind this, and we made sure that we explained what the process is going to look like so we don't lose buy-in. Then we ensured that we've provided adequate training. We made sure that that training was delivered in the right way, so virtually, in person, what have you. The next thing we did was we identified all of the documents that are going to be impacted by this, and we began the process to update them. And then we ensured, lastly, that all of those things together created a safe environment for this technology rollout. And we've verified that by checking with our various stakeholders, training, safety, etc. So now we've gotten through the rollout, we've come up with our plan, we've pushed it all out, we've taken whether it's thermal imaging cameras or whatever, and we've taken it to all the places that they need to go. So let's talk about what we do after that. So this is where quality auditing or testing comes in. So this is such a critical part of rolling out equipment, and it's something that we tend to miss. And so what I mean by that is we need to do some sort of a verification so that we know that the way we wanted this to be rolled out or deployed is how it happened. And so what I like to do is the first step is to figure out how much do we need to test. So let's take Bluetooth for an example. We finished our Bluetooth project some time ago and we paired all of our radios and SCBAs so that, you could talk straight into your mask and it was, Bluetooth connected so that it came across your radio. So after that project was done, we put together a quality audit where we had somebody test. I think we ended up testing about 25% of the paired systems, with a system being a radio and an air pack, and that's on the bigger end of a sample size, but because it was safety equipment, we wanted to have a larger sample size, which we'll talk about in a second. And so that entailed somebody going around and checking, does the system automatically pair when you turn the radio and the air pack on? Does it take less than 30 seconds for that pair to happen? Is the communication clear? And then also, does the person using it on that day feel comfortable using the system? So whoever, let's say we tested the Engine 6 A seat system. Does the person riding in the Engine 6 A seat know how to use the system? So just 2 or 3 questions. Of course, this is all anonymous. And then what this allows us to do is to say, okay, let's just say we tested 75 systems. And out of those 75 systems, 70 of them turned on exactly correctly, paired the way they were supposed to, and the person knew how to use the system. And 5 of them, we ran into this problem, and this problem. Well, now we have a pretty good sense of what we need to work on in the next phase of this project, or as this project turns into a program, what are some things that we're going to have to shore up? Is it lack of familiarity, in which case maybe we need to do a little bit more training, or is there an issue with the technology itself, in which case maybe we need to bring some SMEs in, subject matter experts. So that's kind of an example of what quality auditing and testing looks like. And so a general rule of thumb, if you're trying to figure out how big your sample size is, I know I said I did a larger sample size in the Bluetooth project, but generally speaking, I like to aim for about 10% of the total units deployed. So if it's thermal imaging cameras, which it's a little bit different with the testing, item to item, you're going to have to test them differently. But let's say you rolled out 100, units. You're going to want to test approximately 10 of them. And another way to think about this, and this is something that they do in the software world, is it's the square root of the total number of units. And bear with me, I know nobody likes math, but square root is what number times itself equals, your total test units. Meaning, if you have 100 units that you rolled out, what number times itself equals 100? Well, 10 times 10 is 100. So we would need the square root of 100 is 10. So we would test 10 of those units. So to keep it simple, just aim for about 10%. And what you're looking for is a statistically relevant number. Like if we were to test 10% of these units, will that give us insights into how the whole project looks? And generally speaking, that's a pretty good test size. Remember that testing too much or testing everything can bog down the project, and testing too little just gives you non-actionable information or, potentially just useless information. So you want to pick the right sample size, and then you want to put together those results and you want to actually do something with them. Doing a quality audit doesn't make much sense if you're not going to act on the results. So once you get the results, take it to your project sponsor, discuss what that means. Hey, we tested this many systems and this is what we saw. And figure out together with your project team and your project sponsor what the corrective action needs to be, if any. Now, the last thing I want to talk about on today's episode is just some basics on fire department testing. And because this is um, such a challenging topic, honestly, I'll probably do a full episode on it. But just in broad terms, when you test something in the fire department, I like to break it down into alpha and beta testing. So, alpha testing, generally speaking, is much more informal, and it's basically just you and your project team take the equipment or the technology and you just kind of use it in a bunch of different situations or circumstances just to try to get an understanding of how it works, what some of its limitations are, the things that typically go wrong, when this thing fails, what does that look like? And the documentation that I'll typically do for alpha testing is just notes. I'll write down, bullet point notes. Hey, it seems to do this or it seems to do that, or we've noticed this, we've noticed that. And when you get into beta testing, that's a lot more formalized. So that's when you pick a number of stations that you want to test it at. So, maybe we're going to test it at one firehouse or two firehouses, and you come up with safety parameters, which is typically if you're using anything that's life safety, you want to have a backup. If you're testing a 12 lead monitor, a new one, you want to have your old one handy. If you're, so anytime you're testing something where someone's life depends on it, have a clearly established plan B. And so, again, back to the beta testing, you have your safety parameters. You're going to have very specific metrics that you're going to use to track success. So you'll say, hey, we're going to evaluate end user feedback. So how did the people testing it like it? We're going to compare the results of how the system worked with how the old one worked. Whatever your metrics are, that's more formalized, and that's what I would consider beta testing. So alpha testing, much more informal. You and the team are just kind of using the equipment to get a sense of how it works and what its limitations and failure points are. And then beta testing is much more formalized, a structured pilot test or a structured equipment test. And one more practical note on this, sometimes we feel like we have to test everything, when in reality, a lot of times, just based off of, maybe vendor limitations or the limitations of your RFP, there's really only one product that you actually can use, in which case, not much sense in testing it, unless you're testing it to make sure that it works in your specific department, or what they sometimes will call the technology landscape. Does it talk to your other systems? Like if you're rolling out Telestaff or something, will it communicate with the other IT systems that you have in place? Now that testing you might want to do regardless of whether it's the only option available, just because you're going to get some actionable findings, which kind of is a good rule of thumb. Don't test something if you're not going to act on the results of the testing. So just something to think about there. So guys, that's pretty much it. That's the nuts and bolts of an equipment rollout. I really like these kinds of projects. They tend to be shorter. They're one of those projects where you can immediately see the return on investment, and they're just great opportunities to get morale and PR wins from the troops, just giving them equipment that's going to make their life easier or better or more safer. And This is a great example of how project management can really make fire department projects better and smarter. Because if we do this one right, we're not going to have that technical debt. We're going to avoid the frustration that's caused by poorly communicating these rollouts or not providing enough training. And we're going to document them well. And we're going to make sure we get all of our SOGs and policies updated. So just a great way to utilize the project management framework to deliver better equipment for your people. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into equipment rollouts. If you found this episode helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend or coworker or your next project team. Remember that every share helps more departments learn the mindset and skills to deliver better projects. And if you have a question or a topic you'd like us to cover, email us at projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. That's projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. We'll do our best to answer it directly or on air in a future episode. This has been Project Command, bringing command level thinking to every project in the fire service.